So today what we're going to be working on is the inverse of a function. So I would like you to do the try this, which is, it says to solve for y. So both of these, 1 and 2, are in x equals form. So I want you to get y all by itself. Solve for y. All right, so put me on pause and then come back and check your answers. All right, so let's take a look at number 1. So I want to first start off by thinking, all right, I have to get 3y by itself. So how do I get rid of the negative 2? So what's the opposite operation of negative 2? Well, we add 2. So add 2 to both sides. So negative 2 plus 2 cancels. Now remember, I can't add x plus 2, right, because they're not like terms, so it's just x plus 2 equals 3y. Now remember, I'm trying to solve for y, so I want to get y by itself. 3y is 3 times y. Opposite of times is divide, so I'm going to divide by 3. So I get y equals x plus 2 over 3. Remember, there is other ways that you could write this answer. Notice that I have this x. There's really a 1 in front of the x. Remember, the 3 is underneath both of these. So this could be written as y equals 1/3 x, right? Because there's really a 1 in front of the x. So 1 over 3x plus 2 divided by 3. All right, let's try number 2. All right, so I have a plus 9 there. So I'm going to minus 9 from both sides to get rid of the 9 on the right side. Remember, we can't subtract x and 9, so it's just x minus 9 equals 2/3 y. So now hopefully you remember to get rid of a fraction, since this is division. The opposite of division is multiply. So I multiply by the reciprocal, which would be 3 over 2. Both sides. Sorry, that's a 2 in the denominator. So 3 over 2, sorry about that. Both sides, 3 over 2. Notice I put parentheses because x minus 9 is a binomial. So 2 over 3, 3 over 2, that reduces to just 1. And then I have to make sure that I do distribute the 3/2 to inside the parentheses. So 3/2 times x is 3/2 x. 3/2 times negative 9, you can use your calculator, is negative 27/2. Okay, so that's it for that one. Let's talk about inverse. All right, so there is a particular symbol for inverse. So let me just tell you what the symbol is. So when you see this symbol, you know that it is referring to the inverse. And when we're talking about functions, so it looks like this. It's f to the, it looks like to the negative 1 power of x. It's really not, you don't say f to the negative 1 power. It's really, this is called the inverse of f of x. Sorry, I gotta take my dog's squeaky toy away. Hold on. Okay, so remember, this is not f to the negative 1 power. It's the inverse of f of x. So whenever you see that negative 1 and its function notation, that means the inverse of f of x. So what does inverse actually mean? Inverse is a reflection over the line y equals x. So hopefully you remember this from last year. Most of you guys took geometry last year. So it is a reflection over the line y equals x. So hopefully from last year you will remember. So if I have a coordinate plane, x, y, hopefully remember y equals x is the one that's on that perfect diagonal. So if I had a point over here, let's call this A, point A here, and I flip it over the line y equals x, it ends up over here. That would be your A prime. Okay, so maybe you remember what that rule is. The rule for a reflection over the line y equals x is xy becomes yx. So what happens to the point xy? The x and the y change positions. So that's how we want to remember what inverse means. Inverse means to switch x and y. Notice the point. xy became yx. They changed positions. All right, so let's write down some steps on how to find the inverse algebraically for a function. All right, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to replace f of x with y. Because I'm telling you to switch x and y, but it's in function notation, so there is no y. But you have to remember f of x is y. So you're just going to change f of x and make that y equals instead of f of x equals. And then you're going to switch x and y. Right, so you're just going to flip-flop them. And then you're going to solve for y. And then you're going to write using function notation. Actually, inverse notation. Sorry, that says inverse. I don't know what my stylus is giving me a little bit of a hard time tonight with writing. So write using inverse notation. So that would mean, like, I want you to use the inverse of f of x. If the function is g, it's the inverse of g of x, and so on. Okay? All right, let's take a look at the first example, number 1. Okay, so number 1 says, if f of x equals 2x minus 3, what is, and then look at what I have here. It doesn't say what is f to the negative 1 power of x. That means what is the inverse? Remember, this means inverse. And what does inverse mean? Inverse means to switch x and y. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do in my function here is I'm going to change f of x and make it y equals. So y equals 2x minus 3. Now I'm going to switch x and y. So x equals 2y minus 3. All I did was switch x and y. They changed positions. Now I'm going to solve for y. So I'm going to get rid of the minus 3 by adding 3. So I get x plus 3 equals 2y. Now I have to get rid of the 2 in front of the y. Remember, that's times. So opposite of times is divide. So I get y equals, all right, so you could write it like this, x plus 3 over 2. Remember, I said there's different ways that you could write it, and we're going to talk about the different ways. X plus 3 over 2. Another way you could write it would be y equals, remember, there's really a 1 in front of the x, and 2 is underneath both x and 3, so it would be 1/2 x plus 3/2. But we would not be done, so either one of these are correct. But we would have to make sure we write using the inverse notation. So I would write the inverse of f of x. Notice how I said that. The inverse of f of x equals x plus 3 over 2. Or over here would be the inverse of f of x equals 1/2 x plus 3/2. All right, so let's take a look at number 2. All right, so it says if f of x equals 2/5 x plus 10, what is, and see that notation? That means what is the inverse? Remember, this means inverse. And what does inverse mean to do? Switch x and y. All right, so I'm going to start off by rewriting the function as y equals instead of f of x equals. So y equals 2/5 x plus 10. Next, I'm going to switch x and y. That's the inverse. X equals 2/5 x plus 10. Y, sorry. I forgot to change the x to y. Now I'm going to solve for y. So minus 10 from both sides. So x minus 10 equals 2/5 y. Now we have to get rid of the 2/5. Remember, this is division. 2 divided by 5. The opposite of division is multiply. So we multiply by the reciprocal, which would be 5/2 on both sides. Notice I'm putting parentheses around the binomial. Okay, on the right side, 2/5 and 5/2 reduces to 1, so it's y equals. Make sure you distribute, so it'd be 5/2 x. And I have 5/2 times -10, it'd be -25. So I would rewrite it like this, y equals 5/2 x minus 25, because most kids like to have their y on the left side. And then write it using inverse notation. So I'm using f of x. So it's the inverse of f of x equals 5/2 x. Sorry. 5/2 x minus 25. Okay, so let's take a look at the last couple of problems on the back. Okay, so number 3 says g of x is equal to the square root of 3x plus 2, and we're looking for this. Remember, that means to find the inverse. So remember, this means find the inverse. And remember, inverse means to switch x and y. Just keep writing this down. I think the more you write things, the more likely you guys are going to be to remember it. All right, so I'm first going to write this without the g of x. I'm going to write it as y equals square root of 3x plus 2. Now I'm going to switch x and y, so I get x equals the square root of 3y plus 2. Now notice the plus 2. That is under the radical, so you can't subtract it yet. You actually have to get rid of the radical first. All right, so remember, hopefully you remember, to get rid of a square root, you square it. So we're going to square both sides. So I get x squared equals, when you square a square root, they cancel each other out. So then I'm left with 3y plus 2. Now we're going to solve for y. So minus 2. So I have 3y equals x squared minus 2. And then to get rid of the 3, since that's 3 times, we're going to divide by 3. So I get y equals, I'm going to put the y on the left because most kids like to have the y on the left. Remember, there's really a 1 in front of the x squared, so it's 1/3 x squared minus 2/3. You could write it as one fraction. That would be y equals, just put it together, x squared minus 2 all over 3. And then just make sure you write it with the right notation. The inverse, it should be the inverse of g of x equals 1/3 x squared minus 2/3. Or the inverse of g of x is equal to x squared minus 2 all over 3. Okay, now remember, I'm only showing you both ways that you have to write the answer. You don't have to write it both ways all the time, but I'm showing you in case it's a multiple choice question on the next test or in a future test. And when you write your inverse, it might not be how I wrote it in the multiple choice, so you always have to be aware of other ways to write things. All right, number 4. H of x is equal to x squared plus 2. Find, and then we have that notation. Remember, that means to find the inverse. Remember, inverse means to switch x and y. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is rewrite this as y equals x squared plus 2. All right, so I'm going to minus 2 from both sides. Oh, sorry, I'm going to switch x and y first. Forgot to do that. So switch x and y. X equals y squared plus 2. Now minus 2 from both sides. X minus 2 equals y squared. Now, how do we get rid of a square? Well, you square root it. So it's y equals the square root of x minus 2. And now just make sure you write it with the proper notation. So it's the inverse of h of x equals the square root of x minus 2. All right, the last thing we need to go over is the graphing, which is not too hard. All right, it says graph the inverse on the same set of axes of the given function. So here's my function f of x. So the best way to do this is to first find some important points that would help you graph this function. So I'm going to use this point here on the left, right? So that point there, and I'm going to write this is f of x. And that point is negative 8, 2. Find that middle point right here. That middle point is negative 5, 5. And find this point right here on the right side, and that's 2, 7. So now I want the inverse. Notice how I'm writing this, the inverse of f of x. Now remember, inverse, switch x and y. Switch x and y. So then this becomes 2, positive 2, 2, negative 8. This one becomes 5, negative 5. I'm just switching x and y. 2, 7 becomes 7, 2. Now plot the point. So we have 2, negative 8. Plot the point. 5, negative 5. And 7, 2. And then just draw it. Nice and neat. So there's the inverse. And that should kind of look right. Like, remember it's a reflection over the line y equals x. Remember, that's the one that's on that perfect diagonal. Doesn't it look like it's reflected over that line y equals x? Yeah, of course it does. Okay, so that's it. And everybody have a good night, and we'll practice tomorrow in class.